Republican Party was just like the old patent medicine drummer that used to come around our country. He had 2 bottles of medicine. He'd play a
When Europe erupted into the chaos of World War I in 1914, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, declared a stance of neutrality. Wilson vowed to keep America out of the war, insisting, "We must be impartial in thought as well as in action." Despite his commitment to trade with both sides of the war, the British naval blockade against Germany severely restricted the US's ability to trade with the Central Powers. Consequently, the US ended up significantly supporting the Entente powers by supplying them with vital materials, food, and munitions. This support not only bolstered the American economy, but also led to a thriving industry and agriculture sector. American banks and financial institutions extended large loans to the Entente powers, further entangling the US economy with their war effort. Despite its official stance of neutrality, the US faced mounting pressures and provocations that tested its resolve. German U-boat attacks on merchant ships, including the infamous sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which resulted in the loss of American lives, outraged the public and strained diplomatic relations. In response, Wilson demanded that the German government take immediate steps to prevent the reoccurrence of such incidents. As anger against Germany grew, former President Theodore Roosevelt led an interventionist movement, calling for war against Germany. President Wilson resisted these calls and narrowly won the 1916 presidential election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." In his second term, Wilson continued his policy of neutrality while supplying the Entente. His government's biggest concern was the potential resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany and the sinking of US ships. Unbeknownst to Wilson, the German High Command was indeed considering reinstating this policy, but it was ultimately rejected by the German Kaiser. With this decision, there would be no justification that could convince America to join the war. As the war in Europe gradually turned against the Entente, American investors began demanding more assurances from Britain and France. President Wilson remained broadly popular. During the remainder of his term, the temperance movement reached its zenith, advocating for the prohibition of alcohol, with attempts to implement prohibition at the federal level. However, wet senators successfully filibustered these efforts to ban the sale of alcohol. Consequently, this setback led to a decline in public support for the movement over time. Wilson had hoped to run for a third term, but suffered a serious stroke in 1919 that left him medically incapacitated. In Europe, the Weltkrieg eventually came to an end, with the Central Powers emerging victorious. Despite the defeat of the Entente, which led to significant losses for American investors, US industry and enterprise continued to flourish. Entering the next election with widespread public support, the Democratic Party campaigned under the banner of "We kept you out of the war." The Democrats nominated William Gibbs McAdoo, Wilson's Treasury Secretary, who ultimately won the 1920 presidential election. McAdoo's term began with a flourishing economy and optimism for the new decade, marking the onset of what would later be known as the Roaring Twenties. With the revolution in France and Russia, the influence of syndicalism and Bolshevism began drifting to the United States. The Socialist Party of America, SPA, the main socialist party in the US, drawing support from various left-wing groups, found itself increasingly divided. In 1919, the election of the Socialist Party of America's National Executive Committee saw control of the party fall to its more radical left wing for the first time. One of the newly elected members was John Silas Reed, or as he preferred to be called, Jack Reed. A freelance journalist based in New York City, Reed had written for both mainstream and radical outlets. He covered the Mexican Revolution in 1913, but his most significant experience was travelling to Russia in 1917, where he witnessed the October Revolution and the rise of the Bolsheviks. Reed chronicled his experience in his book 10 Days That Shook the World, which was released to much attention in America's leftist circles. Reed became an enthusiastic supporter of the new socialist government and began working closely with them. He developed close ties with the inner circle of Bolsheviks, including Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin. Deeply committed to their cause, Reed delivered a passionate speech at the Soviet Congress, declaring his intention to bring the message of revolution to America. He returned to the United States in 1918, determined to spread the revolutionary ideals. The simultaneous decline of Bolshevik Russia and the ascendance of syndicalist France created a division within the Socialist Party, culminating in the Emergency National Congress of April 1920. Key leaders clashed over whether to support the emerging French communards or the faltering communists. John Reed played a crucial role in bridging this divide by proposing that collaboration between French socialists and the CGT could inspire a similar partnership between the estranged American Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, and the Socialist Party of America, SPA. The IWW had distanced itself from the SPA in the early 1900s. The prominent socialist figure Eugene Debs made a rare appearance and successfully persuaded the party to not only endorse the syndicalist revolution in France, but also to embrace the return of the radical labour organiser Bill Haywood and the IWW back into the fold of the SPA. This action set the stage for reconciliation within the American left. John Reed embarked on another journey to Europe, this time to study the newly established Commune of France, which had achieved victory on the French mainland. During his visit, he was impressed by the efficiency and stability of the CGT government in comparison to the Bolshevik regime. This experience led Reed to become a staunch advocate of the syndicalist cause. Meanwhile, President McAdoo faced his first serious domestic crisis in Mingo County, West Virginia. This crisis stemmed from a violent labor dispute in Matawan that resulted in 10 deaths, including the mayor. Thomas Felts, the chief of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, sought to prosecute Matawan Police Chief Sid Hatfield and others for the death of his brother. When Hatfield and his deputy Ed Chambers arrived unarmed for their trial on 1st of August 1921, they were gunned down by Baldwin Felts' agents, sparking outrage amongst West Virginia miners who organised and armed themselves. On August 25th, about 10,000 United Mine Workers UMW coal miners, against the advice of union leader Mary Mother Jones, marched to Logan, an anti-union stronghold. After clashing with local forces, they seized the city. President McAdoo threatened martial law if the miners didn't disperse, prompting federal troops to intervene under General William Mitchell's command. The troops surrounded the town, demanding the miners surrender or face treason charges. Following aerial bombings and tear gas attacks, most miners surrendered, though they hid their weapons. The promised amnesty turned out to be false, leading to trials and executions of key leaders. In the aftermath of the so-called Mingo War, Vice President Alexander Palmer launched a campaign of left-wing suppression known as the Palmer Raids. Thousands were arrested without trial, but the raids largely failed due to their disorganization and the national outrage over the Mingo executions. These events strained relations between organised labour and the Democratic Party, particularly with the American Federation of Labour. The shock and anger over the executions of the Mingo War's leaders drove leftists to unite under the Socialist Party of America, which began to grow as an electoral force. This marked just one of the labour disputes McAdoo encountered. In the spring of 1923, Seattle was engulfed in a general strike. Workers from various unions and backgrounds united, initially to demand concessions from the city and its industries, but soon expanded their ambitions. They formed a general strike committee, later declaring the Seattle Commune, effectively governing the city from early April to mid-May. John Reed, back from France, actively engaged in the Commune's affairs, emerging as a prominent advocate for the workers. The mere mention of a commune sent shockwaves through McAdoo's administration. The president once again threatened martial law, and upon news of imminent army deployment, the General Strike Committee dissolved and normalcy resumed. Unlike the events in Mingo, this uprising saw no executions due to a lack of substantial violence. John Reed's writings on the episode bolstered the appeal of syndicalism in America, propelling him into a leading role within socialist circles. During this period, the general public largely backed the president's decisive measures to quell disruptive strikes. With the economy remaining robust, McAdoo was perceived as a steady and composed leader, steering the nation. Consequently, he secured re-election in 1924. In that year, global turmoil unfolded with the eruption of the British Revolution. President McAdoo tried to calm Wall Street, assuring that the situation remained manageable. However, by mid-April 1925, it became evident that the Royalist government was on the verge of defeat. America's primary trading partner endured a devastating setback, triggering a financial panic. On April 20th, the New York Stock Exchange experienced its most significant drop in history, abruptly ending the Roaring Twenties and heralding the beginning of the Great Depression. In the wake of the stock market crash, the United States found itself grappling with the devastating consequences of the economic downturn. Businesses faced plummeting demand, leading to widespread layoffs and closures. Unemployment soared, reaching unprecedented levels as families struggled to make ends meet. Banks faltered under the weight of mass withdrawals, exacerbating the financial turmoil. The collapse of the British government also led to American companies grappling with the stark realization of losing millions of dollars they invested in both France and Britain during the war. Consequently, loans and contractual agreements were left unfulfilled, prompting calls for the government to demand repayment of the debts from the exiled governments. President McAdoo's administration was thrust into crisis mode as he grappled with the unfolding economic catastrophe. In response, he swiftly implemented a series of measures aimed at stabilizing the banking system. Despite his efforts, however, the Great Depression would only worsen. A few months later, on July 12th, the American left convened a special pan-union Congress in Philadelphia, gathering delegates from both the IWW and the AFL. At the Congress, Reed and several other IWW leaders unveiled a plan for establishing a large umbrella organization. This organization aimed to coordinate union activities and policies, with the ultimate goal of sparking a syndicalist revolution in the United States. Tentatively named the Combined Syndicates of America, it was envisaged as the one big union, encompassing the anti-revolutionary factions which sought change through peaceful means and the revolutionary factions. They also declared that the CSA would officially endorse the SPA and utilize it for electoral operations. Despite McAdoo's efforts to offer relief to struggling businesses and households, his measures failed to produce immediate results. Unemployment remained high, and economic instability persisted, leading the public to blame him and the Democrats for the situation. German dominance over global trade progressively pushed the United States out of the European, African, and Asian markets. This, combined with the gradual loss of political prestige on the world stage and the sharp economic decline, created a vicious cycle of escalating domestic and social dissent. As a result, there was a surge in the popularity of socialism in the United States. In the 1926 midterm elections, the previously fringe Socialist Party jumped from 5 to 23 seats in the House of Representatives, and Seymour Stedman was elected as the first socialist senator in the history of the United States. By 1925, McAdoo's policies had proven ineffective, leading him to decide not to stand for re-election. The Democratic Party nominated Al Smith, the governor of New York, as their presidential candidate. Meanwhile, the Republicans nominated the highly popular and nationally renowned figure Herbert Hoover, known for his humanitarian work. Hoover's strong polling numbers positioned him well ahead of Al Smith, and he campaigned on the promise of implementing a comprehensive rail construction program to address unemployment. His platform received widespread acclaim from the American press. The SPA nominated Norman Thomas, who led the anti-revolutionary wing of the CSA. On election day, Herbert Hoover easily defeated Al Smith, securing a decisive victory in the election. However, Norman Thomas managed to win several Midwestern states, showcasing the viability of the Socialist Party. John Reed also ran for senator in New York State and achieved an upset victory. This convinced him that perhaps reforming the country from the top was possible. During the transition from the McAdoo to Hoover administrations, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was swiftly proposed and ratified, moving the presidential inauguration from 4th March to 20th of January. Hoover attributed the primary cause of the Depression to a fundamental lack of confidence in the financial system. Upon assuming office, he promptly reversed McAdoo's previous relief policies, advocating for a more hands-off approach to governance. He emphasized the importance of allowing the market to correct itself, and focused on strengthening businesses such as the banks and the railroads, while avoiding direct government intervention. In just a few months of his presidency, the economic situation worsened under Hoover's administration, with his policies exacerbating the downturn. Unemployment rates surged higher and consumer demand nosedived, pushing the economy into a downward spiral. Banks, operating without proper regulation and oversight, struggled to cope with another round of massive withdrawals, resulting in widespread failures. As the financial system edged closer to collapse, confidence in the economy eroded even further. Despite congressional efforts to introduce federal unemployment relief, Hoover opposed any such initiatives. Another disaster struck with the onset of the Dust Bowl, as severe drought and unsustainable farming practices caused massive dust storms, devastating agricultural communities. Ruined crops, lost livestock, and shattered livelihoods followed, forcing many farmers to flee to cities for work. This influx strained urban areas already struggling with high unemployment rates. Despite the crisis, President Hoover hesitated to provide federal assistance, preferring local or charitable relief efforts, which many found inadequate. With the Great Depression gripping America, various figures rose to prominence. Among them was a charismatic and controversial politician from the South, Huey Long of Louisiana. Huey Long, known as the Kingfish, emerged as a powerful and influential leader despite his humble beginnings. Born into poverty, Long's ambition led him to law school, and he passed the bar exam in 1915. He quickly made a name for himself by being elected to the State Railroad Commission at just 25, where his calls for fair regulation of utility companies and a tax on Standard Oil gained him popularity. In 1928, after a failed attempt in 1924, Long won the Louisiana governorship with strong support from discontented rural districts. His vivid and passionate speeches, combined with his eccentric antics, soon made him nationally famous, earning him the nickname Kingfish. As governor, Long implemented an ambitious program of public works and welfare legislation in a state long neglected by its wealthy elite. He introduced a free textbook law, launched extensive road and bridge construction projects, expanded state university facilities, and established a state hospital offering free treatment for all residents. He campaigned with the powerful slogan, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown," symbolizing his vision of economic justice for all. This phrase defined his dedication to uplifting the working class, resonating deeply with many Americans and offering hope for a fairer society. Long opposed excessive privileges for the rich and financed his improvements through increased inheritance and income taxes, as well as a severance tax on oil. These actions earned him the bitter enmity of the wealthy and the oil interests, but solidified his reputation as a champion of poor whites. However, despite Long's folksy demeanour and likability, his leadership concealed a ruthless autocracy. Surrounded by gangster-like bodyguards, he exerted control over the legislature through intimidation and force. Long further cemented his power by appointing loyalists and family members to key positions across the state, leading to accusations of nepotism and corruption. When faced with impeachment proceedings for these allegations, Long manipulated the system to his advantage, using his influence to adjourn the session before any action could be taken against him. Seeking greater authority, Long pursued a seat in the US Senate. Unlike his peers, he employed direct attacks, insults, and colourful rhetoric against his opponents. Upon his election to the Senate in September 1930, Long aggressively advanced his agenda, effecting significant changes in Louisiana's government. He dismantled local governance structures and assumed personal oversight of all educational, police, and fire department appointments statewide. Long consolidated control over the state militia, judiciary, and electoral processes, leaving citizens with no legal recourse. Despite his supporters' admiration, critics condemned Long as a virtual dictator of the state. His ambition had begun. Entering the 1932 presidential election, little had improved in the country. Despite slim odds of victory, Hoover and the Republicans decided to press forward with his candidacy. Meanwhile, the Democrats, hoping for a revival, witnessed internal divisions as Huey Long sought the Democratic nomination, only to face opposition from the party establishment which backed Maryland Governor Albert Ritchie due to concerns over Long's unpredictability. During his election campaigning, Hoover encountered some of the most hostile crowds ever witnessed by a sitting president, enduring consistent heckling along the trail. The 1932 election emerged as one of the most chaotic in history. As the somewhat recovered Democrats and the rising Socialist Party of America gained ground, they peeled off several states from the Republican Party. This fragmentation prevented any candidate from securing a majority of electoral votes, leading to the invocation of the 12th Amendment. The election was then decided by the House of Representatives in an extremely contentious decision, ultimately resulting in Hoover's re-election for a second term as President of the United States, a decision with lasting repercussions for the American political system. Enraged, Long parted ways with the Democratic Party, condemning both mainstream parties.
We've tried the Democratic Party, then we've gone back and tried the Republican Party, and unfortunately, whenever we get into power with either one of these parties, we find that the one crying need of our people, the redistribution of wealth, so that none will be too poor and none will be too rich, is always neglected by the party that is in power.
The triumph of the Socialist Party of America in the election served as a watershed moment, persuading the American establishment, the press, and the public that the socialist movement was here to stay and would continue growing. Some even went so far as to declare the demise of the two-party system. The CSA now believed that given the re-election of Hoover and the current state of the country, the SPA had a legitimate chance of winning the presidency. However, they felt that Norman Thomas was not the man to achieve this. John Reed, a more charismatic and inspiring figure, seemed like a better candidate. Reed embraced the opportunity and announced his candidacy for president as early as 1932. Endorsements poured in from all corners of the CSA, rallying behind his campaign. Reed delivered a rousing speech on the radio, passionately unveiling his vision for the future.
Today I present to you a vision for a brighter, fairer future for our country, a vision rooted in the principles of socialism and syndicalism, putting the needs of the people above the greed of the few. I will nationalize the banks of Wall Street and ensure they serve the public good, not the interests of the wealthy elite. No longer will banks be allowed to foreclose on bankrupt homeowners. Instead, we will create a financial system that works for everyone, providing stability and support for hardworking Americans. We will embrace the principles of syndicalism, ensuring that workers have a direct say in the management of their workplaces. This means strengthening our unions and enshrining in law the rights to collective bargaining. State and federal authorities will be mandated to recognize and support a union's right to exist and engage without exception. We will put an end to oppressive practices like yellow dog contracts that seek to undermine the power of organized labor. Together, we will build a socialist America where the financial sector is accountable to the people, where workers have the right to stand united and demand fair treatment, and where every citizen has the opportunity to thrive.
Hoover continued with his stubborn policies, convinced they were right for the country. The Democrats tried to introduce an unemployment relief bill, the Garner-Wagner bill, yet Hoover vetoed the legislation. Huey Long began to hint he was going to run for the presidency as a third party.
If the events continue as they now are and circumstances are what they appear to be, it's almost certain that I will be a candidate.
Labour strikes, supported by the CSA, continued to escalate, leading to frequent clashes and riots between workers and the police. In reaction to this growing unrest, far-right factions began to rise and push back against the labour movement. This alarmed the establishment. In response, Hoover instructed military planners to revise War Plan White, the contingency plan for dealing with severe domestic turmoil. He also placed more trust in General Douglas MacArthur, a rising star within the establishment. MacArthur had asserted that the government must stand firm against any rising political extremists. Consequently, Hoover extended MacArthur's term as Chief of Staff. In 1934, Huey Long officially announced the formation of the America First Party and declared his candidacy for the 1936 presidential election. He declared that the AFP would put Americans first and foremost, and that he would lead the nation against the rising threat of syndicalism. The America First Party quickly gained popularity, winning support across the South and attracting millions of voters. Long introduced his economic plan, Share Our Wealth, arguing that the nation's wealth was sufficient for everyone to live comfortably, but was unfairly concentrated among a few millionaire bankers, businessmen, and industrialists.
We expect to see the 48 states of America and the United States fall in line with Louisiana's Share Our Wealth program. That will mean that there'll be no such thing as a man without a home and something to eat and something to wear and a job. If you allow a big man to have billions, then all of us can't have anything else.
While critics labelled his policies as a form of light syndicalism, Long denied these claims, asserting, "This plan is the only defence this country's got against syndicalism." He also launched his motto song, "Every Man a King."
Every man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. That's fine. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring, there'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, with every man a king.
Although Long's policies were initially perceived as left-wing, his America First Party swiftly evolved into a central nationalist force, attracting supporters from both right-wing and far-right ideologies. This broad appeal led Long to being labelled as a right-wing populist. Asserting that his party welcomed all who believed in America, it rapidly became a big tent encompassing a wide range of right-leaning ideas and figures. Among these supporters were charismatic personalities such as the controversial radio preacher Father Charles Coughlin. With his regular broadcasts reaching millions of Americans, Coughlin wielded significant influence, and his endorsement of Long lent a powerful voice to the movement.
When men become so prideful that they believe their destiny is to rewrite the eternal law of God, it's time for their fellow citizens to rise up in their wrath and, through the agency of ballots and not bullets, to relegate them to the pages of the past.
Additionally, the party garnered support from other notable figures, including the radical spiritualist and esoteric political theorist William Dudley Pelley, who directed his Silver Legion paramilitary to fight in the name of the America First movement. Industrialist Henry Ford also rallied behind the cause, spurred by personal tragedy and contributing millions to the party after his son fell victim to a syndicalist assassin. Furthermore, national celebrity Charles Lindbergh, following the tragic loss of his son at the hands of a convicted German immigrant, became deeply involved in nationalist politics. The AFP swiftly accumulated seats during the 34th midterm elections, further fragmenting the US Congress alongside the SPA. Hoover appeared completely out of touch. Despite the infancy of polling, reports suggested that his popularity sank as low as 5%. Soon, he earned the infamous title of the most hated man in America. With the AFP and SPA now outpolling both Republicans and Democrats, deep concern gripped the two establishment parties. As the 1936 election drew near, it seemed poised to become a four-way race. Both Huey Long and Jack Reed had announced their candidacies, with indications suggesting they would secure electoral seats. Long was expected to dominate in the South, while Reed was anticipated to carry the Midwest. Meanwhile, the remaining states were likely to be divided between the Republicans and Democrats. This scenario raised the likelihood of another election where no candidate would garner enough votes to claim the presidency. Hoover had finally realized that federal aid was necessary and promised not to veto the reintroduced Garner-Wagner bill, which was seen as the last chance to offer relief to the unemployed before the election. Due to the divided Congress, passing the bill would require support from either the AFP or the SPA. However, the worst occurred on February 3rd, when the Berlin Stock Exchange crashed, bringing down Germany and the rest of Europe and ushering in what became known as Black Monday. The collapse of Europe's economies quickly impacted America, erasing any progress Hoover had made and effectively delivering a death blow to the US economy. This further galvanized support for Reed and Long, as more people clamored for radical solutions to end the Depression. Both the Democratic and Republican parties had actively opposed the SPA and AFP, rejecting any demands from Long or Reed regarding concessions in the Garner-Wagner bill. Determined to defeat the bill, both men vowed to sink it. After an incredibly close vote, the bill ultimately failed to pass. Long and Reed blamed the establishment for the failure, leading to riots and protests erupting in parts of the country. With violence escalating, the AFP and SPA each formed their own paramilitary units. The AFP established the Minutemen, and the SPA created the Red Guards. These factions took on the role of protecting their party's strongholds and rallies, often engaging in violent clashes on the streets, armed with weapons and prepared to break the law. The Republicans and Democrats grew increasingly fearful of the prospect of Reed or Long winning, seeing it as a threat to American democracy itself. In a desperate move, the parties entered negotiations and even reached out to the progressives. In a landmark decision, the Republicans, Democrats, and progressives agreed to form a coalition unity ticket. However, in a controversial move aimed at thwarting Reed and Long's appeal, the coalition believed the best strategy was to nominate a charismatic progressive outsider capable of matching Long and Reed's appeal, while also addressing the public's desire for change. Floyd B. Olson, governor of Minnesota and member of the Farmer Labor Party, emerged as their choice. Olson, also known for his progressive stance, had worked closely with unions and supported initiatives for the poor. Despite receiving praise from both Long and Reed in the past, Olson made clear his opposition to radical parties and affirmed his loyalty to American democracy. He was offered the nomination as a compromise candidate, which he accepted, making the unity ticket, a groundbreaking coalition, official. His running mate was Quentin Roosevelt, the favored son of President Roosevelt and senator from New York. Despite facing opposition from various factions within both parties, the higher-ups agreed to support the ticket as much as possible. Olson then delivered an impassioned speech.
What we want is to create an economic system so that we can produce enough wealth to satisfy the needs of all the people. We want every man, woman, and child in the United States to have enough to eat. We want every man, woman, and child to have a decent home to live in and decent clothing to wear.
The election was officially underway and had become a three-way race. Long and Reed denounced the coalition as a ploy by the corrupt establishment to maintain power. All three candidates hit the campaign trail, each drawing massive rallies and being perceived as populists of different factions. The campaign quickly turned ugly, with party militias disrupting political rallies and openly fighting each other. The violence escalated to assassination attempts on Reed and Long, and local politicians were stabbed by extremists. As tensions mounted, Hoover enacted War Plan White, deploying the National Guard across America to maintain order. The SPA and AFP groups openly clashed with the National Guard as the election continued. Both parties rejected any responsibility for the attacks, claiming their paramilitaries acted independently. Meanwhile, the FBI uncovered gun-running operations and intercepted a weapons shipment believed to have originated from the Commune of France, indicating that both paramilitaries were rapidly arming themselves. General MacArthur publicly denounced Long and Reed, stating,
"The actions of these radical factions are nothing short of treasonous. They are fostering an environment of lawlessness and rebellion, posing a serious threat to the safety and unity of our nation. Let me be perfectly clear. Any form of resistance against the federal government, especially one that involves violence and illegal armament, must be met with the full force of the law."
Finally, on Election Day, with a united Republican and Democrat vote, Olson decisively won the election, winning over 300 electoral votes. Both Reed and Long contested the election. Reed claimed there had been voter suppression, while Long alleged the election was rigged and insisted that he had actually won. Long even went as far as giving a mock speech accepting the position of president. President Hoover called for calm and urged the public to support Olson and ensure a peaceful transfer of power. General MacArthur reiterated his warning to radicals, emphasizing the consequences of any attempts to undermine the US government. As 1936 drew to a close, the SPA initiated a New Year's Day strike that paralyzed industries across the North. They vowed that the strike would persist until their demands were fulfilled, prolonging the standoff indefinitely. In January, Olson was inaugurated as president, and during his speech, he stated,
"We are assembled during one of the most crucial periods in the history of our nation. I stand before you with a vision for a new approach, one that has not been tried yet. I believe in restoring prosperity by enhancing the purchasing power of the man at the bottom. A nation cannot be preserved if it does not first preserve its citizens."
President Olson declared that his first priority was resolving the strike and announced he would host negotiations with John Reed, believing him to be a reasonable man. The reaction to this was intense. Huey Long and his party declared that the American sellout to the Syndicalists had begun. As a stipulation for the unity ticket, Olson agreed to appoint both Republicans and Democrats to his cabinet, resulting in a largely fractured administration. John Reed accepted the invitation for the talks. As Olson prepared to depart, his new cabinet expressed their disapproval, warning that no deals with Reed could be made and that his life could be in danger. General MacArthur also warned the president and assured him that he would be standing by if the strike were to escalate. As Olson departed for the north, his vice president, Quentin, headed west to reassure the Pacific states. Olson gave one final speech to reporters explaining why he was meeting with Reed. "Today I am endeavouring to save the system we call capitalism by attempting to curb self-individualism and the avaricious profit motive. I will meet with Reed and we will settle this strike. I promise we will bring big changes to help every American." Huey Long outraged at the negotiations, demanded to be invited, and warned the America First Party could not be ignored. Olson, genuinely wanting to find a compromise, accepted Long's involvement. As the three sat down to negotiate, Long and Reed fought on every topic, unwilling to agree with each other on anything. Olson, acting as mediator, tried to find a middle ground. The talks dragged on for days, as the days dragged to a week. The three men were finding stuff to agree on, finding common ground on their relief policies. The president was hopeful things were coming together. But then he received word from General MacArthur stating, "The cabinet is deeply concerned and needs you to return at once." Startled and puzzled by the message, Olson paused the negotiations. Long and Olson departed in different planes. The president demanded an immediate explanation but received no word from the capital. Unbeknownst to him, the cabinet believed the negotiations had dragged on too long and feared Olson might empower the Syndicalists without consulting them. As Olson landed in the capital, General MacArthur, with the permission of the cabinet, initiated his plan. The president was promptly arrested by the US military. Simultaneously, General MacArthur and the army seized control of the capital and the Congress. In collaboration with the government cabinet, the general declared an emergency administration and assumed control of all branches of government. Olson was placed under house arrest, while Douglas urgently dispatched a telegram to other states. "The emergency government is safeguarding the nation from extremist threats before it's too late." The country was stunned by the abrupt actions. MacArthur, granted authority, attempted to enforce nationwide martial law, securing key government institutions and infrastructure while asserting control over media outlets. Despite these efforts, confusion and resistance hampered the implementation of many directives. In response, Huey Long condemned the government, framing the actions as an elite power grab, and called on true Americans to rise up. Meanwhile, in the North, John Reed delivered a radio address from Chicago, rallying oppressed people against MacArthur and Long. Governors across the Steel Belt swiftly declared support for Reed and the CSA. The Red Guard mobilized, seizing army posts and erecting roadblocks across northern states. In the South, governors aligned with Huey Long denounced federal actions as tyrannical. As the South and North became openly rebellious, the general decided to convene an emergency session of Congress to explain his actions.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you in a moment of grave importance, a juncture in our nation's history that calls for bold action and unwavering resolve. As your Chief of Staff, entrusted with the solemn duty of protecting the United States and its cherished values, I have taken an extraordinary step to prevent a dire threat from engulfing our great nation. Our democracy, born out of the sacrifices of countless patriots, is under threat. Forces that seek to undermine the very principles that have made America a beacon of freedom and opportunity are gaining strength. The syndicalist revolutionaries, with their promises of radical change, and the longists endangering our democracy, threaten to tear apart the fabric of our society, upending the values that generations have held dear. I want to make it clear that my actions were not taken lightly. They were born out of a profound commitment to preserving the liberties that we hold sacred and ensuring that our nation remains a bastion of democracy, free from the grip of ideologies that have led other nations down the path of destruction. The President's intentions, however well-meaning they may have seemed, threaten to compromise our sovereignty, hand our nation over to radical ideologies, and place our citizens at the mercy of unproven and potentially disastrous policy. I stand here today not as a usurper of power, but as a guardian of our Constitution, a defender of the principles that have guided our nation for decades. My actions were a last resort, taken only when all other avenues had been exhausted. I am fully aware of the gravity of my actions, and I am prepared to accept the consequences, whatever they may be, for the greater good of our nation. It is my hope that in the coming days we can unite in support of the new emergency administration to ensure the preservation of our democracy, the protection of our freedoms, and the well-being of every citizen. Let us find common ground to move our nation forward together. In this critical moment, I call upon every American to reflect on the principles that define us as a nation. Let us remember the sacrifices of those who have come before us, and let us honor their legacy by standing united against ideologies that threaten to undermine the very essence of who we are. Thank you, and may our shared commitment to liberty and democracy guide us as we navigate these uncertain waters.
In the West, the governors of Pacific states declared MacArthur, Huey Long, and John Reed traitors, affirming President Olson as the legitimate leader whose government they would recognize. They also refused to arrest Vice President Roosevelt. General MacArthur declared that any state failing to recognize the emergency government would be deemed in a state of rebellion. He issued a 30-day ultimatum. All states must either stand down and accept federal authority, or face imprisonment or execution. A tense standoff ensued, prompting MacArthur to mobilize federal troops in compliant states. However, thousands of National Guard troops deserted their posts and failed to report for duty, exacerbating the unrest. Riots and widespread chaos erupted across the country as tensions escalated. Reed declared MacArthur a tyrant, prompting syndicalist militias in the Steel Belt to rally in support of the CSA. Volunteers quickly joined their ranks. In the South, Long and the America First Party called upon men to enlist in their cause, mobilizing the Minutemen and the Silver Legion to form the foundation of a Southern army, with additional volunteers gradually stepping up. States across the South began declaring their support for Long. In Baton Rouge, Huey Long delivered a fiery speech. "A tyrant has branded us traitors. Let us march north as traitors, but return home as kings." Meanwhile, in the West, the Pacific governors declared a state of emergency. Speaking on behalf of the states, Governor Frank Merriman insisted that MacArthur must step down, demanding the restoration of civilian government and the release of the rightful president. They initiated the mobilization of their own National Guard and called for volunteers to defend the West. In the Steel Belt, John Reed declared what he termed the February Revolution, proclaiming to his supporters, "Direct action against capitalist society is now crucial for all Americans. The federal deadline must not only be ignored but defied. The revolution has begun." In response, the CSA initiated the formation of what they dubbed the Second Continental Army. In the Northeast, the governors refused to follow MacArthur's command, but were dealing with syndicalist militias in New York and New Jersey. Meanwhile, a few governors in New England requested Canadian assistance in the event of war. As the ultimatum's final days counted down, and factions mobilized their armies, the emergency administration hastily convened a joint session of the remaining Congress to pass a new presidential succession law. This legislation declared that in cases of presidential incapacitation or absence, the cabinet would be empowered to transfer the president's authority as commander-in-chief to a military officer. General MacArthur was quickly sworn in as acting president amid the escalating crisis. He issued a final warning for the traitors to stand down. As the ultimatum expired on its last day, the North, South and West were officially declared in rebellion. The Second American Civil War had begun.
What we are hearing is simply terrible. They are calling this a Second American Civil War. God help us.
You can now support the war effort on Patreon. We need you. Join up by subscribing to this channel.